Our next coveted speaker, Alex Newman, is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, and consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything he does. Man after my own heart. In addition to serving as president of Liberty Sentinel Media, Inc., he's written for a wide array of publications in the U.S. and abroad. He currently serves as a contributor to the Epoch Times, a correspondent for the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, a foreign correspondent and senior editor for the New American Magazine, and a writer for the World Net Daily, an education writer for Freedom Project Media, and a columnist for the Illinois Family Institute, and much more. Can you please help me welcome Mr. Alex Newman?
Thank you, guys. It's wonderful to be here. And so I've been going to the UN Climate Summit since 2009, and I've learned a lot from going there. In fact, when I was in college, I really didn't have much of an opinion on climate. But as I started going to these summits and I started interviewing, at this point I've interviewed hundreds of climate scientists, virtually all of them on the skeptical side. One of the interesting things is the alarmists don't really want to talk to me, which is interesting. I've reached out to the UN IPCC more times than I can count. I just did an article a couple weeks ago about these major new studies in the peer-reviewed literature showing that almost all, in fact all or even more than all of the observed warming of the last few decades can be explained through the urban heat island effect and changes in total solar irradiance. I reached out to Gavin Schmidt. He didn't respond. I reached out to Michael Mann. They didn't respond. And I think that's interesting. If you're confident in what you have to say, if you truly believe what you're arguing, why would you not want to talk to somebody who maybe has a different opinion? So I've watched this evolution. When I was a kid, they were still promoting the global cooling thing. It slowly morphed into global warming, then climate change. And as I've been going to these climate conferences, I've noticed this increasing shrillness. It became the climate crisis, then it was the climate emergency. I was on the Sinai Peninsula last year for the latest UN Climate Summit, and it became, we're headed to climate hell, and I'll show you guys that. And so, I'm not here to necessarily talk about the science. I'm just going to share with you some of my observations, and I believe you can disprove the entire narrative without knowing anything about science. One of the things you do is you look at the predictions they've made. They've made 50 years now worth of predictions on the climate, and they could not be more wrong. Unless you think I'm cherry picking, I challenge you to find some predictions that they've made that have actually come true. Look for falsifiable predictions where they said this will happen by this date, and what you'll find is in every case that I could find, they were absolutely wrong. Here's one interesting graph. I use this a lot. The red line right there is the average of the UN's climate models and their predictions for what would happen as CO2 concentrations increased in the atmosphere. What you see with the green and the blue lines is what actually happened as measured by the weather balloons and the satellite data. I tell people, and I'm only half joking, you could give dice to a monkey in a cage and have the monkey roll the dice, and the monkey would have a much better track record of predicting what would happen to the temperature based on this data. And the laws of probability would suggest that something very fishy is going on here. Every single one of their predictions massively overestimated what would happen to the temperature. Now you go back to the 1970s and even into the 80s, they were warning of the ice age that was coming. A University of California professor, Kenneth Watt, an ecology professor, warned that if present trends continue, the world will be 4 degrees colder by 1990, 11 degrees colder by 2000. That's twice what it would take to put us in an ice age. They predicted starvation and other horrors. In 1971, the next year, Stanford University professor Paul Ehrlich, author of the infamous population bomb, he's a neo-Malthusian who believes there are too many of us on this planet. You find this theme is very common among the climate alarmists. Back then he was warning about global cooling. But he said by the year 2000, the United Kingdom is going to be a small group of impoverished islands inhabited by some 70 million hungry people. If I were a gambler, he said, I would take even money that England would not even exist in the year 2000 and give 10-to-1 odds that the life of the average Briton would be of a distinctly lower quality than it is today. And of course, that all failed to materialize. 40 years later, he was warning that we were going to become cannibals because of global warming. And I suspect he's wrong about that as well. Now, in 1975, and don't think it was just Newsweek, all the big publications were harping on this global cooling. This was called The Cooling World. It was a major article in Newsweek. They said climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climate change or even to allay its effects. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the solution to global cooling was exactly the same as the solution to global warming. Less energy, lower standard of living, more government control, more taxes, less fossil fuels, etc. And thankfully, nobody listened to these quacks back then. They actually reported in the article that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed by these man-made global cooling theorists included melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. So again, thankfully, nobody listened back then. Now, in 1991, the Club of Rome got together. This is Al Gore and Mikhail Gorbachev and globalists and communists and very influential so-called environmentalists. The Cold War was winding down, and they knew they needed a new justification for this massive government and these huge taxes. And so they came out with a report. It was called The First Global Revolution. And they said, in searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea of global warming. This would fit the bill. They said this is caused by human intervention, and the real enemy then is humanity itself. Frankly, I don't think humanity is the enemy of the planet. That's my personal opinion. Now, the UN has made many silly predictions over the years. This one I pulled right off of their website. In 2005, the UN Environment Program predicted that there would be 50 million climate refugees by the year 2010. And on this handy map, they showed you where the climate refugees would supposedly be coming from. You can see the purple areas, the pinkish purple. That's where the climate refugees were supposed to come from. And what's really interesting is they could not have been more wrong. Those were actually the fastest growing population centers on the face of the planet. Here's some of the data. They had the Bahamas, an increase from 300,000 to 350,000 over that time period. 5% increase in Santa Lucia. The Seychelles population increased by 10%. Solomon Islands, 25%. 6 of China's fastest growing cities were within the zone that was supposed to mass produce climate refugees. Literally, they could not have been more wrong. I'm from Miami. They've been telling us for a while that my city was going to be underwater. It's not. In fact, my parents have a house on the water. It hasn't moved one iota as far as I can tell. Now, in 2003, the U.S. Defense Department issued this absolutely silly report. They called it an abrupt climate change scenario, its implications for U.S. national security. And they found that it was not implausible that by 2013, California would be flooded with inland seas, Netherlands would be unlivable, polar ice caps would be all but gone, surging temperatures, mass increases in hurricanes, and resource wars and mass death. The press went even further with this, doing what they do. Now the Pentagon tells Bush, climate change will destroy us. Okay, that was 19 years ago, and I don't know, I don't feel very destroyed just yet. In 2007, the BBC Fake News put out this headline, the Arctic summers will be ice-free by 2013. Well, 2013 came and went. Ice actually in the northern hemisphere expanded by about 50% from when they made that prediction. There was no correction. There was no apology. There was no nothing. They cite supercomputers and experts to make these silly claims, and of course, when they're wrong, they just pretend like it never happened. The UN IPCC report, the AR4, in 2007 claimed the Antarctic ice sheets were rapidly shrinking. They claimed that this was evidence of accelerated loss through 2005. In 2013, with the AR5, they doubled down on this. They said they had medium confidence in the projections of this massive ice loss. Well, NASA dropped a nuclear truth bomb on that claim. They actually put out this press release in 2015. They found massive gains in Antarctic ice, totally contradicting everything that the United Nations had claimed would happen. Was there an apology? No, of course there wasn't. Okay. Now, thankfully, the American people are not believing this. You won't learn this from reading the press, and you wouldn't ever guess from looking at what's going on in the schools. But this poll just came out earlier this year from the University of Chicago and AP North Center for Public Affairs. When they did the poll properly, first they ask Americans, do you believe in climate change? Then they say, do you believe it's man-made? Less than half of Americans believe the man-made global warming hypothesis. And yet the politicians in Washington want you to think that everybody agrees it's simply not true. Another way you can show, without any science at all, that the people leading this bandwagon do not believe these things themselves is by looking at what happened in 2015. I was at the UN Climate Summit in Paris, and it was very bizarre. You had world leaders celebrating their accomplishment. And what they accomplished, you had Barack Obama and all the Western leaders said they were going to dramatically slash CO2 emissions from their populations within 5, 10, 15 years, depending on which country. Then the Communist Chinese said, well, we will continue increasing our CO2 emissions until about 2030. For perspective, Communist China already releases massively more CO2 than all of the Western world combined. Every unit of economic production in Communist China releases drastically more CO2 than that same unit of economic production would in the United States or Japan or Switzerland or Canada or Australia. The worst possible thing you could do if you believe CO2 is bad for the planet is shut down American industry, shut down American manufacturing, and ship all that to China. And yet that's exactly what they did, and they patted each other on the back and gave each other high fives. How could you do that if you really believe CO2 is bad for the planet? Here's some more data on Communist China's CO2 emissions versus American CO2 emissions. Very interesting. So what did they do? As their predictions all failed, well, they just increased the shrillness. One of the things that NOAA did, they actually changed their color scale. There's the 2008 color scale. It doesn't get dark red until 110 degrees. Starting in 2014, it gets dark red at 90 degrees. So you probably grew up and you saw bright red. You said, oh, no, that's terrible. It must be really warm outside. Well, in 2014, that all changed. Here you see the side-by-side comparison. Another thing that happened is the media doubled down on this. Over 500 leading so-called media outlets got together and they signed a statement promising to start referring to climate change as the climate emergency. And you would all recognize the names of these publications. They're very big and very well known. Another thing they decided to do is just silence people who point all of this out. Here's the UN communications czar, Melissa Flemings, talking to the World Economic Forum about their partnership with Google to suppress everything that we are putting out.
You know, we partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. You know, we own the science, and we think that the world, you know, should know it, and the platforms themselves also do. But again, it's a huge challenge that I think all sectors of society need to be very active in.
Yeah, we own the science, she goes on to say. And I can confirm that this is true. My article on UN Agenda 2030 that I wrote in 2015, right when it was adopted, was at the top of every Google search result for years. When you typed in Sustainable Development Goals, UN Agenda 2030, Agenda 2030, every single result brought back my article. Now you literally cannot find that article on Google, period. Even if you put in the exact headline with my name, you have difficulty finding it. It takes pages and pages. So they're doing this deliberately. They're doing it strategically. They know they're losing on the science. They know they're losing public opinion. So they're indoctrinating our children, and they are censoring people who point out the flaws in all of this. Now, you know, they tell you that all scientists agree. That's absolute baloney. Like I mentioned, I've interviewed hundreds of scientists over the years. I'll give you just a handful of, representative handful of examples. So at the latest climate conference, they came out with a document that said we needed to totally restructure the world's energy systems. They said literally trillions of dollars had to be invested in this. What are your thoughts on whether that's a good investment or not?
You know the answer to that, so why are you asking? I mean, it's a terrible investment. It's a waste of money, and it's going to hurt billions of people. It's immoral.
Immoral. That's Richard Lindzen, meteorologist emeritus at MIT. This is Dr. Nils Axel Morner. He passed away. This is me and him at the Baltic Sea, at the edge of the Baltic Sea in Sweden. He was a sea level reviewer for the UN IPCC. And he told them they could not publish this. This was fake. There was no global sea level rise. It was all a hoax. Well, they published it anyway, so he resigned. But this is what he had to say about sea level rise.
So tell us a little bit about this whole sea level issue. I just came from the COP24 in Poland, and over again we heard that our cities are going to be flooded. I'm from Miami. They say my city's going to be flooded. Are we all doomed from sea level change to start with?
Absolutely not. I mean, there is no big rapid sea level rise going on today, and there will not be. On the contrary, if anything happens, its sea will go down a little. But also there is nothing which is called global sea level. It is different in different part of the world.
It's a 30-minute interview. I encourage you to watch it. YouTube deleted it, of course, so we had to repost it on Rumble. They deleted it after it got 100,000 views because that's what they do. They don't want you to see the truth, right? He was the head of the geophysics department at Stockholm University, was widely known as the world's top sea level expert until he started exposing these lies. Here is our colleague here spoke about him a moment ago, Dr. Will Happer, Princeton physics professor emeritus, also Donald Trump's climate advisor more recently.
Does the world need carbon taxes?
No, of course the world doesn't need a carbon tax. They're talking about a CO2 tax, and CO2 is actually good for the world, so people ought to be encouraged to make more of it.
So why do you think they're pushing this idea of a CO2 tax then, if CO2 is good for the world?
Well, it's a combination of people who've been misinformed badly, people who need to feel virtuous. They don't believe in anything anymore, so now they've got something to believe in to save the planet. And then it's the opportunists who are making a good living out of frightening everybody and sucking money out of the common man, you know, to push idiotic energy solutions on them that make everyone poorer and provide less reliable energy, less affordable energy. So there's nothing good about it. It's the same evil fanaticism that's plagued mankind since we began.
Actually, I was at the UN Climate Conference in Paris, as I mentioned. I met Dr. Yves Marco. He was a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain in chemistry. He was also the head of the European Chemical Society. He's also passed away. But here's what he had to say.
Evidence, I repeat, not one single physical scientific evidence that shows that carbon dioxide emitted by human beings has any effect whatsoever on the temperature of our Earth.
So what is going on, you might ask? Well,
carbon dioxide. And if you have a culprit, you of course have someone behind it who's the faultive of that. So the human being is in fact the guy who generates this noxious, nasty chemical. This is almost like a religion, you know. You have the original sin. The original sin is carbon dioxide. The one who committed is the human being. So we all have to repent. This is basically the message which is given there. It's a new religion going on, this, and we call it climatism around here. And that new religion is there to make sure that people, in fact, will pay for that. You will pay for carbon dioxide. You will pay for heating your home. You will pay for everything that touches far or close to climate.
Repent, all ye climate sinners. So the UN's very serious about this. They are really trying to harness religion to push this ideology. They have a thing at the UN Environment Program called Faith for Earth. Here's a little clip.
85% of the world population believe in a faith or a religion. And the power of that is humongous. And we can harness that in mobilizing faith leaders and faith followers in protecting Earth.
They want to harness your faith to fight global warming. Is your faith for being harnessed? Okay, I was at the last year's climate summit in the Sinai Peninsula, and a group of leaders in partnership with the UN organized this big religious ceremony. They unveiled the new 10 Commandments I'll share with you in a moment. And 4 of the ringleaders, I did a long interview with them. Here's just a couple clips from them on religion. This is Rabbi Jonathan Nerel, the head of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development.
And religion and religious clergy and leaders need to be the delivery vehicle for climate action.
So is your religion a delivery vehicle for climate action? If it is, it's pretty shallow. Here's another one, James Sternlich, CEO of the Peace Department.
One conduit for reaching millions upon billions of people around the world is religion.
What? Yeah, so religion is a conduit for reaching people with climate nonsense. Okay, the first thing I saw when I got off the plane in Egypt was this. This was an official UN poster, Welcome to Egypt, the Dawn of Conscience. And they have a really interesting take on morality. Your sin is polluting the earth or the water. Okay, and it's actually from an ancient Egyptian pagan document. And hey, you got to let me into the afterlife. I didn't pollute the earth or the water. Sounds very similar to what we're seeing now. Just right before they had this UN climate summit, the UN Development Program released a report saying that basically these morals and ethics that evolved with mankind over thousands of years are no longer adequate for our current needs for taking care of Mother Earth. They say we need fundamental changes in choices. We need people to act according to new moral codes. And so they've got new moral codes for us. They walked up to the top of what they say is Mount Sinai. They did a climate repentance ceremony, and then they unveiled the new 10 Commandments. Okay, this is actually a picture of what happened. They took tablets and they did the whole thing with the Moses, smashing it on the thing. I don't think they saw the irony there, worshiping the calf and everything. But I interviewed, like I said, the 4 ringleaders of this thing, and one of them had some interesting things to say after I asked them about what was going on.
All religions teach us to respect the creation that we have been given, and we've done kind of a terrible job of that. And so with a new kind of 10 Commandments of climate change, which are an addendum to, not a replacement for, the original 10 Commandments, and a third covenant that we're some kind of working on between mankind and creation, that we would refocus on those elements of the teachings from across religions that point us in the direction of fixing the problems that we've created so that life can thrive on this planet and so that we can build that proverbial kingdom of heaven here on earth.
So there you heard it. All right, so God gave us the original 10 Commandments. The UN and friends gave us the new 10 Commandments. God gave us the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The UN and friends are working on the third covenant so that we can build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. Folks, this is blasphemy, obviously, and yet they're saying it in the open like it's nothing. Okay, here's some of the new 10 Commandments. Creation is not our possession. You got to serve the creation. You got to change your inner climate. You have to repent and return, realize that you're harming the earth. Compassion means feeling the pain of the earth. I'd like to see a chapter and verse for that one. And now this climate hell idea. Here's the Secretary General of the UN just about 9 or 10 months ago.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
The highway to climate hell. Here we go. And Joe Biden.
We're racing forward to do our part to avert the climate hell that the UN Secretary General so passionately warned about earlier this week.
All right, so if you just pay Al Gore enough money for carbon emission credits, then we can avoid climate hell. Okay. Actually, at the 2010 UN climate conference, the lady who was running it at the time, Cristiana Figueres, she opened it up with a prayer to the Mayan goddess Ixchel, which was interesting. I whipped out my laptop. She said it was the moon goddess and that she was the goddess also of tapestries and creativity. So I whipped out my laptop and who is this Ixchel? First thing that came back was that she was the goddess of cannibalism and human sacrifice. I thought that is very appropriate for this conference. Now, I couldn't find the video. I think the UN deleted it, but here it is from the Washington Post. They also tried to delete their article, but I managed to find it in the archives. It's got all the quotes in it. So she asked this Ixchel to please help us have creativity to weave a tapestry of solutions to global warming. In 2012, I was down in Rio for the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, which was literally chaired by a member of the Communist Party of China. And they lit up the statue of Christ in bright green. And Lord Christopher Monckton, who I was hanging out with at the time for writing an article, said this was a childish message that now the environmental religion is replacing Christianity. Now, we'd argued for a long time that this had really serious religious elements, and then along comes Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the UN IPCC, to confirm it for all of us. He got caught, I think, molesting a woman or something. He had to resign. And so he writes this crazy resignation letter where he actually just drops a bombshell. He says, for me, this is more than just a mission. This is my religion and my dharma, which, okay, you're a pagan. That's fine. You can have whatever religion you want, but don't ask me to pay for your religion with my taxes, please, okay? Now, they also, Figueres from earlier, she said, this is the first time we're actually working to restructure the entire global economy. So they're using fear. They're using fear to try to manipulate you into giving up your freedom. The policies they're promoting, and I'll tell you this as somebody who's been to so many of these UN conferences, population control, energy policies that would hurt the poor, these things are absolutely contrary to Christianity, to Catholic doctrine, to the Bible, to everything that Christians hold dear. God didn't send us a spirit of fear, right? Trying to terrorize people about their carbon emissions is wicked, and it needs to stop. So we need truth, not propaganda, and we need Google to stop censoring people who point out everything I just shared. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Alex. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Take me back to the classroom of young children, of young parents, because I know you are a young parent, because then you're connected with many parents. What's going on with these children and the education? Because obviously, those physicists and other scientists and educators who don't see what we see, they're sick. But what's going on with our children?
I would argue that the education system, so-called, is the primary mechanism they're using to advance this narrative. It's not happening just in the United States. It's happening all over the world. The UN and UNESCO are leading the charge. They're trying to put climate propaganda into absolutely everything. They say this rather openly. If you take a look at Agenda 21, which was signed in 1992 on behalf of the United States by George H.W. Bush, and almost every other national government in the world, they actually tell you in Chapter 36 that education is indispensable for changing people's attitudes. They say it needs to include spiritual education. I actually have a copy of the Agenda 21 book for children. It's got lots from Al Gore, totally dedicated to climate propaganda. And then you see blatantly teaching things like overpopulation. They have a whole page with a bunch of storks delivering babies, and I think it's Hindu deities up on a cloud. They look very upset. And on the next page, they tell you what the problem is. It says the earth groans every time it registers another birth. God told us to be fruitful and multiply, yet they're teaching our children that having babies is bad for Mother Earth. And you can apply this to any issue. I do believe the reason they're working so hard on getting the children is because they realize they're not going to get the adults anymore. Obama famously called conservatives and Christians bitter clingers. They're clinging to their guns and their Bibles, their religion, and they're not willing to change. So I do believe that indoctrinating children in public schools is the primary mechanism that they are using to bring not just the United States, but the whole world on board with this. We see it with Greta Thunberg. Every Swedish child is getting an overdose of this kind of propaganda in school. It is happening everywhere. They're teaching them that the gas they exhale is a toxic pollution, but if they pay enough taxes to the UN and buy enough carbon credits, that somehow they're going to make the temperature of the earth perfect. It's ludicrous, but a kindergarten child doesn't know that, right? They were told by their parents to listen to the teacher, and so we're in this situation now where we've got a whole generation of young people who've been totally indoctrinated with this, who've actually been conditioned to not think about it logically, not think about it reasonably, not examine the evidence, but just shut down mentally whenever they hear something that contradicts it. So I believe that's the biggest crisis we're facing when it comes to this issue, is the indoctrination of our children and everything that follows from that, right? It's bad enough that they believe absurdities, but when you take these absurdities at now the core of their belief system and you extrapolate the implications of that, they're being told that having children is bad for the planet. How are they going to start families? They're being told that energy is bad. They're being told that agriculture is bad. John Kerry's now been running around the world saying that we have to shut down 1/3 of the farms. Right? It's simply craziness, and it needs to be stopped.
I have a comment regarding your discussion interview on sea level rise. First off, it violates Archimedes' principle to say that it's higher in one city than it is in another. What's happening is that the relative land is going up and down in those two cities. A second, more important observation is there have been historically two different standards of time. The definition of the second originally was based on the rotation of the Earth, 1/24th times 1/60th times 1/60th of the length of a day as measured astronomically. More recently, with the advent of atomic clocks, it's based on frequency of a cesium hyperfine structure. To keep the two in sync, the Earth, it is noticed that the Earth's rotation rate wanders around a little bit. So the standards bureaus around the world would occasionally add a leap second every few years to adjust for minor variations in the clocks. I noticed that in fact, okay, it's a straightforward, rather simple calculation to do. If the Earth's oceans were rising, then the moment of inertia of the Earth would increase. Imagine a skater who lets her arms out. She slows down. She brings her arms in a spin. She speeds up. The same thing would happen to the Earth. If the Earth's ocean were rising, and it's relatively straightforward to calculate from how much, if it's the order of a foot or more, as is claimed, then the Earth's rotation rate would be slowing down. Actually, it's speeding up.
Thank you. And yeah, actually, if people watch that 30-minute interview with Dr. Nils Axel-Morner, he gets into precisely that. He shows, we actually film it, he shows a marking that a Swedish king had made, I believe in the late 1700s, on a rock where the sea level was. He shows that that's now several meters above where the sea level is, and so he explains that Scandinavia, the land is going up. Other places, like in Venice, the land is sinking a little bit, and so he explains exactly that. But he also uses a variety of just physical observations to show that the narrative is totally fake, like in the Pacific Islands. He had been traveling back and forth for, I think, 60 years, he said, to a particular island in the South Pacific, and he had been measuring the distance of the high tide line to a particular tree. And what he found was that in 60 years, it did not move at all. The distance was exactly the same throughout that 60 years with minor variations up and down during the year. So he explains all of that in that 30-minute interview. Again, you can't find it on YouTube anymore because they deleted it, but that is available at Rumble. And I encourage people to check it out because he gives you some insight into the inner workings of the UN IPCC and how they deliberately ignored all of his warnings that they couldn't publish the lies that they ended up publishing in their sea level section. And I think that's all we have time for. Yeah, okay, thank you.